Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
The book's about a transformative era in media history, roughly between 1990 and 2010, when network and mobile communication rose and newspapers essentially declined. There's no sort of static ideal of journalism out there, but journalism is really being remade all the time. And it shifts and changes along with the people that are practicing it, according to economic, cultural, political factors. And this is just the same thing that's happening with all cultural industries, but it has a particular anxiety because it's so closely associated with our idea of the health of public life. In fact, cultural industries have really embraced network era changes with varying degrees of resistance and acceptance. And earliest on, the music industry famously criminalized their customers and lost a lot of revenue and a place, sort of in society because of it. And on the opposite side of the spectrum, the gaming industry co-opted their customers, turned users, and turned them into, basically integrated them into the product and became the most, the highest earning industry in the media business. And news fell somewhere in the middle. At first, mostly they ignored the shifting landscape and kept their heads down, sort of attempting these superficial changes that left the core of the way that their business model and their professional practices and norms largely unchanged. But as the news industry dragged its feet, a new style network journalism has taken shape in the larger media landscape. And this new sort of set of actors and products and practices depends on new tools, new players, and new sensibilities. For example, many of us think that watchdogging is the most important role of journalism. It's what you typically hear anxieties about the decline of the industry being associated with. And the rise of the web and the fall of the newspaper business model has heightened these anxieties about journalists' ability to carry on this role as watchdogs. We need today accountability journalism perhaps more than we ever have. Yet watchdogging or accountability journalism isn't the only task of journalism, nor are professional journalists exclusively qualified to do it. And I think this preoccupation with watchdogging on the part of journalism critics and scholars is a sort of holdover, it's a lens brought over from the mass media era. There are emerging forms of journalism that seem to be reviving some central but forgotten roles of journalism, namely promoting dialogue and public engagement. Both The Guardian and Salon.com in the United States, it's an online magazine, have really sophisticated social networking sites that make the voices of the public much more central than they ever have been in a professional news outlet. And also outside traditional news outlets, there's countless examples of new tools and practices that are giving new dimensions to news. For example, Twitter and other social networking and gaming platforms, magazine journalism designed for tablets and phones, and also there are news-style organizations like One World, which is based here in London, which provides a platform to harness the voices of people often unheard in public debates. So these new dimensions are emerging in part because who is a journalist and what is journalism is really expanding. Today, journalists are sometimes software developers. They're creating new tools and architectures of the news media environment, and they may well be wielding the most influence over the shape of the future of journalism of anyone. And journalists are also curators and collaborators, and by this I don't just mean Arianna Huffington, I also mean it's all the people who are helping us sort through information and get access to stories and ideas we otherwise might not. Journalists are also comedians, activists, pranksters, working outside the boundaries of the profession in order to broaden and deepen public discourse. So this is all just to say that journalism is growing more and more diverse each day, and to support the point that we should stop judging journalism based on views carried over from the era of mass media, and stop equating saving journalism with saving the news industry. To me, there's nothing untrue about the many arguments and the many books and articles that talk about how accountability journalism generated by traditional news outlets has declined both in quantity and quality. This is a fact. And we're no longer collectively exposed to the same news. And contemporary political polarization does seem intense, especially in the United States in an election year. But, and I really believe these are important elements of the shift of journalism to acknowledge and to document. But my quarrel with the scholarship and commentary that focuses on these perceived flaws of the emergent environment is primarily its very narrow focus and its amnesia to the shortcomings of the old model. Now, while everything is in flux, I think we really have an opportunity to charge up democracy by bringing the public back into the center of the work of journalism. And I think we have a lot of possibilities and potentials if we use what's available to us in the networked media environment.
This idea that it's not about saving the journalism industry, that journalism is more than just people who earn a living from it as such. What about the business model in the broadest sense, in that, especially in America, but let's be honest here as well, there is the sense that these journalism brands, these journalism institutions, some of them are dying off, and most of them are being kind of denuded of the resources that they typically enjoyed perhaps in the past, the foreign bureaus and so on, time for investigative journalism. Do you think that what you're talking about somehow replaces that? Are you happy to see that legacy media disappear?
No, not at all. I mean, I'm not talking about replacing professional journalism entirely, and I don't think that's going to happen. In fact, the journalism institutions that are surviving are the ones that are adapting. So some of the most brilliant things are coming out of newspapers like The Guardian or the New York Times, where they've been laying off reporters, which is a tragedy, and certainly they would be better if they could have enough resources for both, but they're laying off reporters and hiring developers. And in creating new platforms, they're more wisely using their resources so that they can tap into the environment. So, for example, there's all sorts of really interesting projects going on at the New York Times in particular where they're collaborating with other news organizations and getting together information, and so that everybody can still do good reporting even though they don't have as much resources. And this to me seems like in much better spirit of public interest than the old day where you would take down notes and as a journalist and then burn them so nobody else would find them. I think the point is that we need a combination of the two, and that the pressure from the outside sort of networked journalism environment can better the mainstream journalism and help them figure out a way to be more distributed and more less hierarchical in the points of view that they share with the world.
In your book you give lots of case studies, the BBC, for example, New York Times and so on, and they're all recognizable. You can walk up to them and they've got buildings, and I know they're journalism institutions. But what about, I don't know, Twitter? What about Facebook? Do you sort of embrace that as part of the digital sphere, or do you want to describe something more, definable as journalism?
Well, I mean, I think that it would be hard to look at Facebook and Twitter, for example, as not significantly influencing the journalism landscape. And I wouldn't go so far as to say every tweet is an act of journalism, but I think that in almost every international news event of the last maybe 2 years at least, Twitter and Facebook have been major sources for the news. So international journalists are using it to find out what is the news in places where they don't have people on the ground, but also to inform and shape the news. So oftentimes in the past, or most oftentimes, how we understand what is going on in the world beyond what we can witness is based on top-down accounts. So we talk to the officials in the government or the professors that are experts, and now we have this channel that has come from other places within society. So Egypt is a great example. I mean, if we didn't have access to people on the ground, if journalists didn't have access to people in the square, and reporters didn't somehow manage to get information from the ground in Egypt, which was made much more easy using new tools, then who knows what account we would have gotten of what was happening there, especially given the fact that many countries around the world have been supporting the dictatorship there for a long time. I mean, there was no possibility that the story could have been covered up because we had this access to people on the ground there.
Obviously, the counter-argument to that is it's too confusing. You've got this abundance of material. How can you trust it? I mean, even talking about the Syrian one, but also that some people may be on Twitter, a lot of people aren't. The way that those information flows may distort things, and that if I can get my material off YouTube, why should I send a correspondent? So isn't there a danger that you're actually going to emerge with a much more complex, confusing
Well, I think
picture?
in some ways what's happening is that this is precisely why we need journalists and why we need journalists to drop their old ways and figure out how to adapt to the new environment. But I also want to stress that I don't think it's just journalists that can sort through these things, because what you find in these various incidents where we rely heavily on Twitter, or journalists do, or the public opinion is largely shaped by things coming from more, sort of grassroots sources, is that, there are people, everyday people, that are experts in different realms. So they end up entering into this space and helping to, sort of curate by retweeting, or, I mean, if you use Facebook, and you're very interested in a topic, usually you have particular friends that are either journalists or people who you trust as experts, who are then reposting information that they've vetted. So the point is that not only can journalists help sort through this stuff, but it opens up the sphere of who has access and how we decide to trust or not trust. And it really has to be a much more active habit of ours as news publics. We can't just open up a newspaper and say, well, this is the brand I trust, so I'm going to trust it. And really, we really never should have been doing that in the first place, And so I think it's great that people can approach information and build up these skills to be able to say, okay, wait, I don't know where that tweet came from. Maybe I'll go see what this other person is saying about it, or who they're retweeting, or, there's also platforms being built where things from social media like YouTube videos and tweets and various other stuff that just comes out there from the web can be quickly verified. So, if let's say somebody sends in a video from Syria, then there's teams of people checking where they say they are versus the weather and the dialect and accent of the person speaking and what's in the background and these sorts of things. So I think we'll improve